How's everybody doing? This is Rot Teahouse. Long on hiatus, unfortunately. Me and Fred have gone through a lot since our last episode. But now that our lives are settling down once again, hopefully, well, mine is. I don't know about you, Fred, but
Doing my best.
we are hoping to get back into it with the tea house here. And just to remind everybody, Rot Teahouse is a podcast where Fred and I review obscure literature, whether that's fiction or philosophy or political thought, which, while it is obscure for the modern audience, we nonetheless think that these works have something to add to our contemporary discourse. The other primary component of Rot Teahouse is, of course, the tea. So every episode, we have a new kind of tea that we drink throughout the recording of the episode. And about halfway through the episode, I, who am not well acquainted in tea at all, give my impressions of the tea, guided by Fred, who is much more acquainted with tea than I am. Um,
Yeah, Alex being, somebody who enjoys coffee primarily, and me being the sort of tea snob of
yeah,
us,
I am
sort
coffee
of
built.
yeah, sort of channeling my experience as a former tea store manager here.
Yeah. And so just to introduce ourselves real quick, again, in case you guys forgot who we are, I'm Alex Palma,
I'm Frederick Gettings.
and this is Rot Teahouse. So let's get into it, I guess. Um,
Yeah, of course, of course.
oh, go
Yeah, I
ahead.
just want to say really fast, it's good to be back doing this project after short, or I guess, a relatively distant hiatus, but glad to be back into it.
Oh, yeah.
Today we have a pretty interesting piece, definitely sticking to our theme of obscurity here. We will be reading and sort of going over Garden Cities of Tomorrow by Ebenezer Howard, who was a sort of pioneer of the Garden Cities movement.
Hmm. And I mean, I think that this book is really interesting to talk about right now in this moment because here in the US and really internationally, we're seeing a lot of anxiety over the cost of housing. And it's leading a lot of people to question, whether our land use policies really are what they should be. And there's, a great deal of interest and debate, especially in what we call urbanist circles, about, uh, you know, topics like city planning, right? Um, and it's really kind of interesting to see because I think, it's definitely become more and more of a hot button issue. And it's causing people to talk and think about not only cities, but communities in general, in a way that people, haven't generally had to before. So maybe Mr. Howard has a different way to think of it. But yeah, I guess I'll give a little bit of a history on Ebenezer, and how Garden Cities came about. Garden Cities, I'll note, and we'll talk about this obviously during this book summary, is a Georgist work. So if you all aren't familiar with Georgism, Georgism is a what is was is a social movement that emphasized land value taxes as a means of basically reappropriating land, right? Um, you know, in that way, I mean, and we can talk about this, later, but it has kind of ties to like political movements like socialism and distributism and mutualism. But moreover, Ebenezer's book is about land use and how we can use land in our communities better. Ebenezer Howard was born January 1850 in London. Growing up, he was extremely well read, and obviously he would have grown up in that like sort of urban landscape of industrial London in the mid 19th century. Um, he was very influenced by an American author named Edward Bellamy, who wrote a book called Looking Backward. And Looking Backward is an interesting book because it's actually like an early form of speculative science fiction. And in that story, a young man is transported to the year 2000 to an America that's been transformed into a socialist utopia. So anyway, it's an interesting story. I mean, actually, that would be kind of an interesting book to do for the podcast too. But so anyway, Ebenezer Howard moves to America around 1870, around the age of 20, where he first tries to become a farmer in Nebraska and fails miserably. After which point he moves to Chicago and he becomes a reporter. And he arrives in Chicago just after the Great Fire of 1871, which destroyed most of central Chicago. And while living there and working as a reporter there, he watched the regeneration of the city. And he also saw the growth of what we could call the suburban sprawl of Chicago. So he really like lived in Chicago like during a key time in the city's history. And actually around that time, 1870, here in Philadelphia, we saw a similar thing happen when there was a consolidation of the city into its suburbs. So this was something that was kind of going on with cities at the time. Cities were changing. There were new technological advances that were happening with trains and streetcars. Um, Nonetheless, Howard eventually moves back to England in 1876, where he works in Parliament as a stenographer and record keeper. And like in that role, he, you know, kind of has a little bit of a sidelines point of view on the politics of the day and what goes into running a government. And so he does that, for a number of years. And later in his life, he becomes more and more interested in this idea of guiding the growth of cities. So in 1899, he founds the Garden Cities Association. And the year before that, in 1898, he writes "Tomorrow, a Peaceful Path to Real Reform." And a year later, or actually a couple years later, in 1902, he releases this book, Garden Cities of Tomorrow. Now, Ebenezer was one to put his plans into practice. Um, Around 1903, he founds a company called the First Garden City Limited, which purchases a lot of land in a town called Letchworth, England. And he buys a lot of land in like the sort of neighboring areas of the city as well. And this company aimed to basically create a whole new kind of community, right? And so they like from the basically the ground up build a new kind of government. They plan the industry and economy of the city. Ebenezer would live in Letchworth or live close to Letchworth, I think, for most of the rest of his life. He's actually buried there. And Letchworth, England, still exists today and still exists in that similar sort of planned economy style, right? So if you go to the website for Letchworth, they actually have a whole tab on their website where they explain how the municipality is the primary landlord in the city, and the rent and revenue that's collected from the businesses and residents who live there are reinvested in the community. It's really kind of it's we'll talk about this later, but it's interesting that it's become almost like a co-op or a credit union type model. Ebenezer is knighted in 1927, 1 year before his death. In 1928, he dies of kind of complications of stomach cancer versus and pneumonia. Buried in Letchworth, the city that he helped plan. And he died relatively poor, despite being seemingly fairly influential at the time. And yeah, so one interesting thing is that he was friends with the playwright, the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw. And Shaw describes Ebenezer as follows, not to throw quotes at you guys, but in this case, I think it's kind of poetic. He says Ebenezer was one of those heroic simpletons who do big things while our prominent worldlings are explaining why they are utopian and impossible. It is, and of course, it is they who will make money out of his work, which is very, very true in many cases even today. And so, interestingly, while doing research for this episode, I discovered that there is one community local to where Fred and I live, well, semi-local in North Jersey, that is influenced by the ideas and writings of Ebenezer Howard. That town being Radburn, New Jersey, which is in North Jersey, kind of a little bit west of Hoboken. And it was founded by Clarence Stein, Henry Wright, and Marjorie Sewell in 1929. And yeah, I mean, it was directly influenced by Ebenezer Howard. It's a pretty small town based on what I was able to find out online, but that town too still exists. And on their website, again, they have the following quote. They say Radburn is a planned community started in 1929 by the City Housing Corporation from the plans developed by Clarence Stein and Henry Wright. The concept of the new town grew out of the older planned communities in Europe and the work of Ebenezer Howard. So yeah, I mean, they gave him kudos right on the homepage of the website, which is interesting to see, right? So it's interesting, that Ebenezer had obviously some degree of influence because some of the communities that he, influenced are still around. So I wonder if he has more to say to us today.
Mm.
But before we get into the summary of the book, Fred, do you want to introduce us to the tea that we're drinking today?
Of course, of course. So typically here at Rot Teahouse, we not only review obscure literature every episode, but we take it upon ourselves to review a tea as well. Sort of fitting into the theme here of being a tea house. Historically, tea houses have been places where people sort of congregate to discuss various ideas and topics. So we're kind of keeping in line with that tradition here on the podcast. Today we are enjoying some yerba mate, sort of fitting in with the Garden Cities theme. Yerba mate is an herbal tea, popular in South America, particularly in Paraguay, Argentina, and Bolivia. It was first cultivated by the Guarani and Tupi people before it became popularized by European colonists, particularly Jesuit missionaries. So it has a pretty interesting history of being a sort of indigenous tea, uh, or herbal tea rather, in South America, that sort of exploded in popularity as colonization happened down there, much in the same way that tea was sort of brought to the West, with like the British colonization of East Asia and whatnot.
Hmm.
Um, Yerba mate is considered an herbal tea, particularly because it does not contain proper tea, quote unquote. Tea, whether it's black, white, oolong, or green, is from the Camellia sinensis plant. The main differentiation is like how it's oxidized, prepared, how it's aged. So yerba mate is actually a bush that grows in South America and sort of matures into a tree. The leaves are taken and sort of roasted near a fire, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, in a process very similar to lapsang souchong, which is a black tea that's smoked to give it a smoky flavor. When roasted, yerba mate has this sort of like roasty element to it. However, its flavor profile is more herbal. Um, Much like the green tea sencha, it has grassy and vegetal notes, and it's typically brewed in a gourd, referred to as a bombilla, and consumed through a metal straw. Typically, it's brewed with milk or fruit juices. Sugar and honey can be added as well to give it a sweeter sort of note. And in recent years, mate has sort of seen a renaissance in popularity as a soft drink beverage, sort of analogous to an energy drink. Think of like your Monster Energy, Red Bull, stuff like that. Mate has seen a sort of resurgence and kind of like being a healthier alternative to that. But yeah, yeah. So I'm very excited. Sort of turned Alex onto mate,
Hmm.
and very interested to hear some of his review of it at the end of this pod today.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you know what I think. I've been sipping it while we were talking. I do have a question though. What is the difference between like this yerba mate, which has this like sort of metal cup and a metal straw versus like the sort of that what is that popular brand of bottled yerba mate? Is that made differently or is it the same stuff?
It is the same stuff. It does have like the constituent plant in the brewing process. However, typically with like the soft drink or like the sort of carbonated mate, it does have like additives in there. I would assume they put things like guarana extract, ginseng, stuff like that. If it's like, the canned version.
Hmm.
But I mean typically you can get mate just straight like bottled. I mean not all mate, is brewed the same way. You can also drink it iced. It is, a beverage you can prepare chilled.
Hmm.
So yeah, I'd say it really depends. If you're unsure whether or not the sort of like mate you have is just like by itself or whether it contains additives, of course, like do your research into the product that you're buying. But for the most part, it's kind of like I guess like an iced tea that you would pick up, it still has the tea in it, but I would assume that it would be processed to a certain point.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. Well, you know what I think. I appreciate you answering the question as well, just because, I don't even know if that stuff is the same, but now I do. Um, Now I do know to what extent it's the same, and that extent is somewhat.
No,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. I guess it's the same in the way that like um the canned iced tea that you get at like your local convenience store is the same as like a loose leaf tea or a bag tea, It's the sort of like base element is like universal, but the sort of like processing kind of, there's like various levels to it, for lack of
mhm.
a better way of phrasing it.
Yeah. So anyway, onward to the summary um of Garden Cities of Tomorrow. Um and we'll summarize the book I guess together just because we both read it and probably have different things that we noticed. Um and then we'll talk about the tea and then we will reflect on the book. So Garden Cities of Tomorrow. My copy is about 98 pages, including the endnotes. So it's pretty short. It's a fairly short book. And it has a good amount of diagrams in it, that demonstrate the sort of political map of what Ebenezer imagined this sort of garden city ideal being. It's 13 chapters, and over the course of those 13 chapters, um, the book actually starts out fairly specific in terms of like how does the government of this garden city work? How is it paid for? What is the budget? What is the revenue? What are the typical expenses that we see? And towards the end of the book, it really starts to get more like, I guess you can say philosophical or more reflective on the society of the time. Ebenezer talks more about individualism versus collectivism, socialism versus capitalism. He talks about some of the other major thinkers that are doing stuff and writing in similar ways about similar topics. And yeah, I mean, basically, what Ebenezer Howard seems to have been shooting for is a way to reconcile what he saw as the strengths of the city and the strengths of the countryside, right? And he had hoped that through careful land planning that there could be a happy medium that would be kind of struck up, right, between the two. Um, and it's really like the outcome of his writings to me are very interesting because like I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, Fred, but it almost seems like a like a kind of like socialist-ish suburban corporatism, which is such a bizarre thing to wrap your head around.
It's definitely a like a way of phrasing it, for
Yeah.
sure.
So basically, like in Ebenezer Howard's city, the municipality as a government would be quite strong. And it would be run by basically like a council of prominent people from the community. And the municipality would own the vast majority of the land in the city, right?
Yeah,
Um,
practically all of it,
yeah.
basically.
And the municipality would be responsible for doling out the land as they feel is best for the city, right? And so there would be a concentration of businesses at the center of the city, and then flaying out, there would be increasingly more and more green space. Um, and this would all be connected, and then this community would also be connected within itself but also to other communities like it via like a sophisticated rail system. And so yeah, you know Howard goes deep into like what the budget for this would be and what the expected revenues would be. um I try, and I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, Fred. I don't know if the math makes any sense, especially because it's in like 1898 pounds. But it's definitely an interesting outlook. Was there anything that you noticed, Fred, about how this was structured?
Yeah, yeah. Typically when we read pieces like this, it typically starts off with the sort of like societal reflection or the sort of base philosophical premises for which like the system will be built on, um, in the forefront of the text. However, Howard sort of turns that kind of like on its head and kind of gets right down to brass tacks here. So basically just kind of elucidating how the city is established, how the city runs, and then going into the sort of like theoretical justifications for it. When the text starts out, he sort of identifies basically three magnets, for lack of a better way of phrasing it. He kind of uses a diagram here, the three magnets being the town, the country, and the town country. The town being analogous to the cities of, the Industrial Revolution at the time, typically being crowded, having high wages, high amusement, however, excessive hours of work, army of unemployed, costly drainage, fog, pollution, basically having the sort of vices and sort of entertainment that like a large city would sort of, naturally give you, but also having these sort of negative elements. Whereas the country has the sort of lack of society, sort of lack of entertainment, in Howard's conception at least. However, it has things such as low rent, uh, it has nature, it has sort of no pollution. So basically, the town and the country, they both have like positives and negatives to them, just pretty much like anything really. But the town country is sort of what, Howard is attempting to sort of unlock here that combines the best of both with allegedly none of the negatives. So think low rents but high wages, low rates of prices and plenty to do. However, you get no pollution and you know, all the enjoyments of the natural world. So basically he's like, if you were to give people the option of living in the town, the country, or the town country, what would they choose? And naturally, given how great the sort of town country is in Howard's, perception of it, naturally people would sort of flock there.
Mm.
Um, he sort of promotes the idea of sort of like what Alex alluded to, these sort of prominent but also very wealthy individuals or organizations effectively raising the money to buy cheap land in the countryside. This would be raised through debentures, which is basically just a fancy way of saying bonds. Think of like municipal bonds or company bonds that you may invest in. And this would essentially raise the fund to buy all the land to sort of develop the city. Howard's sort of conception of like getting this started is basically a mix of philanthropy, but also a sort of like quasi almost proto-suburban development of
Hmm.
arable land in 19th century Britain, um, which makes it a pretty interesting sort of proposal here.
Yeah. Well, this is coming out of, his writings are coming both out of seeing Chicago transformed out of the Great Fire of 1871, but also having grown up in like the ultra dense London metropole, right? I mean, to grow up in London in the 1850s and the 1860s is when it would have been at its most industrialized, right? So it would have been dirty and polluted and overcrowded. And there are a lot of social reformers that were coming about in this era to address the plight of people that were living in cities like this, right? So I mean, I really think that that's like where a lot of this comes from. Not to be too interpretive, we're not at the interpretive stage yet of our summary. Um, but yeah, I mean, overall, it's a book that really tries very hard to plan out like and give a model or a template for like what these garden cities could be, right? Um, And I don't think that the book was without its influence. Like I said, I mean, we could, just by simple Google search, we were able to find a couple of cities and towns that were influenced by Ebenezer Howard's ideas. Um, and, I don't think that it's a coincidence that, this book was written at the turn of the 20th century. And the 20th century, in Western Europe and the United States, in the early to mid 20th century, we see the rise of the suburb, right? And I do wonder how much of that was influenced by books like this one and ideas like these um
No,
about
yeah.
about books that were, I mean, ideas that were dealing with just the sort of difficulty of an overcrowding that was happening in these cities. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the book is quite utopian. It's,
No, yeah, yeah, to kind of like go on to that too. like when you think of like older European cities, say like, one I have direct experience with is like Bratislava, in Slovakia. You sort of have like, the medieval core to the city, and then you sort of have like, you know, the 19th century sort of like, I guess, growth out of that. And then you have like the 20th century sort of industrial area on the outskirts or the 21st century business district. It's sort of how do you say, difficult to take a city that has like hundreds or even thousands of years of history and sort of restructure it.
Yeah.
Whereas, with something like Chicago, for instance, after it gets incinerated and burned down to the ground, you sort of have like effectively a blank slate to
Yeah.
rejuvenate it. And that's very much kind of what Howard sort of starts to elucidate in the beginning of the text here. The garden city that he proposes in the diagrams, and maybe we can, throw up a picture or something on the YouTube version here. But he kind of like gives this like circular structure to it.
Hmm.
I don't think he says that like the garden city has to be a circular structure, but rather this is kind of his envision.
Hmm.
Whereas like in the center of it, he sort of states that there's this crystal palace sort of facility that acts as kind of like a proto shopping mall.
Hmm.
On page 14 of my text, it says running all around the central park is a wide glass arcade called the Crystal Palace, opening on the park. This building is in wet weather one of the favorite resorts of the people, whilst the knowledge that its bright shelter is ever close at hand tempts people into Central Park, even in the most doubtful weathers. Here, manufactured goods are exposed for sale, and here most of that class of shopping requires the joy of deliberation, and selection is done. And then sort of emanating past that, you sort of have, luscious parks, and then you sort of hit basically the housing for, the urban sort of population of the Garden City. And then on the outskirts is where you get the factories, the warehouses, dairies, etc.
Hmm.
This basically is kind of like the outer ring of the city. On page 15 of my text, he says, on the outer ring of the town are factories, warehouses, dairies, markets, coal yards, timber yards, etc., all fronting on the Circle Railway, which encompasses the whole town and which has sidings connected with it to the main line of the railway, which passes through the estate.
Mm.
This arrangement enables goods to be loaded direct onto trucks from the warehouses and workshops, and so sent by railway to distant markets or to be taken direct from the trucks into the warehouses or factories, thus not only affecting a very great saving in regard to packing and cartage and reducing to a minimum loss from breakage, but also by reducing the traffic on the roads of the town, lessening to a very marked extent of the cost of their maintenance.
Mm.
And then outside of that would be the sort of agricultural fields, the farms, etc. So it's kind of interesting in a sense because what Howard is sort of also proposing is a sort of a proto zoning
Hmm.
almost. Whereas in early industrial cities like London, even, places like New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, Paris, etc., you didn't really have that sort of zoning. You often had cramped tenement housings, basically adjacent to the factories where the workers would sort of, spend most of their day. So like what Howard is sort of proposing here is kind of like very delineated sectors of purpose in the city, which gives it, a defined sense of space that like the inhabitants sort of interact with, which for the time was pretty revolutionary and almost utopian, but is sort of how effectively every city, at least in the United States, functions to a degree today.
Yeah. Allegedly, again, I'm not an expert in the history of zoning, but the earliest zoning that we see in the US occurs in Los Angeles in 1906. Now, in Europe, there might be earlier forms of that. But like you said, Fred, zoning was not what it was when this book came out. And so to see Howard advocate for such purposeful uses of land was something that, that was not the way that communities functioned at the time. What I also think is interesting, well, just to highlight in the book, Howard sees the municipal government of so like as much as that this is as much as this is a book about land use, it's also a book about government, right? And how government should function. And so Howard really puts a lot of strength into the municipal government. And I think in his mind, in an ideal society, municipalities would be the primary political unit in a country. And in his schema of how a city should be laid out, they would have three primary departments. One, the Department of Public Control, which would make up the realms of finance, assessment, law, and inspection. B, the Department of Engineering, which would keep the various infrastructure components of the city running. So the roads, the subways, the sewers, canals, waterways, etc. would keep them all functioning. And the third department, which is called the Department of Social Purposes, which would cover education, libraries, bathhouses, and arts and culture. So it's interesting because I'm curious as to the extent that mid 19th century English municipalities had this level of departmentalization of cities, right? Obviously, this is a fairly simple outline of how city government should be cut up, right? Obviously, even the simplest city today would have more departments than that, more departments than three. But nonetheless, it's interesting that he would likewise very carefully plan out basically checks and balances into the municipality. So yeah, no, I think that's another interesting and important part of the summary of this book. I will note, and this is criticism right off the bat, that he has a section that's fairly amusing to me in which he advocates for the fertilization of the farmlands in these communities via the raw sewage coming from the more dense parts of the city. Let me see if I can find that passage real quick. Oh, here we go. So, and I quote, "The waste products of the town could, and this is without heavy charges from the railway transport and other expensive agencies, be readily brought back to the soil, thus increasing its fertility. The question of sewage disposal is naturally a difficult one to deal with, but its inherent difficulty is often increased by artificial and imperfect conditions already in existence." So that's funny. I love that. So before we get into the analysis, and on that appetizing note, I think it's time for our tea review. What do you think, Fred?
Yeah, yeah. I think we can definitely get down to it.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so drinking the mate, very much that sort of like grassy and floral note.
Yeah.
At least in, my specific brewing of it. I prefer mine with milk and honey. I think it gives it the sort of sweetness, that sort of like very much complements the floral aspect to it.
Hmm.
And the milk kind of gives it a nice like creamy texture. Um, I typically don't take milk in my tea. However, mate is one of those exceptions personally. There is no proper way to enjoy it, by all means. If you like it, with something or without something, more power to you. But yeah, Alex, I'm very much interested to hear your take on it.
Well, it's definitely very grassy, very green tasting. Tastes very healthy. Um, I did not put honey in mine, but I did put milk. So it is it has almost like without the honey, it has a little bit of a bitter note. almost like a licorice type bitter, like a black licorice to me flavor. Um, and having the metal straw is fun. I like that. It does make it so that you have to be careful when you first make first brew it because the metal straw really conducts that heat. So you kind of have to really let it cool down before you drink it. Um, and I don't know, but it seems to me to be quite either caffeinated or whatever because I do have a little bit of a jolt with that, with the mate going.
It is quite high in caffeine,
Yeah.
which, makes it a pretty good alternative to coffee or even traditional tea, if you're not too big a fan of it. Yes, I mean, it's a good way to get your day started or uh, you know, whatever you need to get done.
hmm And I will say it seems like the straw would be a little difficult to clean after because it's got all these little kind of plant particles in it. But the kit that I bought has a little brush, so we'll try that out later and see how hard it is to kind of clean up after. But yeah, it's fun. It's a fun little drink. It's kind of like I kind of like how it has like a little how it has components to it. It feels very technical to make as compared to other teas.
It's pretty unique in the sense that it has the paraphernalia for brewing and consumption.
hmm
I mean, it's not the only tea that has it. I mean, matcha is a pretty involved beverage to make, sort of like powdered Japanese green tea, or even something like stovetop chai, even. I mean, tea can be a very involved beverage, much in the same way coffee is. Mate has the sort of all-in-one sort of
hmm
approach, which, makes it, a pretty fun beverage to, have. Not so fun to clean up though, as evidenced by the straw.
But yeah, no, thank you for introducing me to this yerba mate, Fred. I'll definitely be making it again sometime. It's a
No, of course.
it's a good it's a project drink, so in that way it feels like kind of a nice relaxation type of thing to do, because you have to get the kit out and clean it up a bit and put it together. It's different than a normal tea bag where you just throw it in a cup with hot water.
No, yeah, of course. That's one of my favorites. I don't drink it all the time, but I drink it occasionally and when I do, it never lets me down.
Mm. All right. Um, so moving on to our final section of the podcast, the book review. What do you think?
So I'm actually a pretty big fan of this text. Ebenezer Howard sort of had this vision of making the living conditions of the working class in early industrial or I guess late industrial society better, or just kind of more comfortable in the day-to-day you know, living environment. And I think we're kind of at this point right now where the cost of housing and the quality of housing is a pretty big concern for many people. And the sort of approaches that we're going to need to sort of rectify that are going to be radical and force us to think outside the box, much in the same way that Howard was trying to do at his time. There's a lot to be said about Howard's proposal, whether or not the sort of structure that he's proposing is viable. A few sort of concerns that I was thinking of when I was reading the text is whether or not the structure of government for a garden city would be able to exist within, the context of a given nation that might have, certain restrictions or legal requirements for local governance, whether or not a self-contained city economy could really exist. He does give some pricing here. For instance, he goes into the expenditure of the city, how much each individual would have to pay to sort of pay off the debentures that initially funded the land purchases, etc. While those numbers could add up in Howard's sort of like self-contained experiment here, you do have to take that in context to like a much larger national global economy when you consider things like recessions or inflation, whether or not his proposals would be financially or economically sound, in my opinion, would be kind of questionable. What I'm more interested in is sort of the ideas later in the text, particularly his sort of push and pull between the sort of like individual initiative of the individuals within the society and this sort of like socialistic element that he's also trying to bring forth here.
Hmm.
Um, he kind of has uh he is a proponent of capitalism. Howard is by no means like a Marxist or a socialist or, you know, anti-market by any chance. However, he is under this impression that if you do give people the freedom to pursue their ends, within the context of the Garden City, they would be driven to use their talents, to use their entrepreneurial spirit to give back to the community. Um, it's almost kind of like a quasi or analogous, I guess, to Benjamin Tucker, who is sort of an early individualist anarchist thinker, who was pro-market or sort of like pro-entrepreneurial almost, but believing that to sort of segue into a resolution of like what was known as the labor problem, being bad workplace conditions, having people pursue their own ends, and sort of seeing that working together would sort of, I guess, bring about like a more egalitarian system of exchange and whatnot. Um, I do think it is a pretty timeless question, but within the context of Howard's work, um, you know, I do kind of see a push and pull. I mean, if you give the municipality sort of like full control over like the local economy, for instance, or he at one point he goes into like the idea of monopoly, that there would be some producers that have a monopoly over certain goods and services, but if people were dissatisfied, then the municipality can open up more land to bring a competitor in, and that would be kind of like the way by which people, voice their dissatisfaction with that producer. How that jives with capitalism, personally, I really don't see. I mean, um, it kind of seems like Howard is somebody who wants his cake, but also wants to eat it. He kind of wants municipal government. He also wants like this sort of like free market economic aspect to it, but also having democratic control of land and sort of like enterprise. So, I mean, it's a very varied text, but overall, I do think Howard sort of gets to, an essence of a radical thinking and sort of pushing the boundaries of how we organize the space in which we live in. So, I mean, in that regard, I do think it is a pretty rewarding text to read.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that this book is probably much more influential than most people realize. You know, and I think that a lot of our contemporary discourse about land use and what cities can be and are like owe a lot to this text, without a doubt, certainly. Um, there are, a few things that are a little rough, right? Like the sewage thing to me definitely got me. But the other thing too is I think his plans kind of require like a urban tabula rasa, right? They kind of require, at least in this text, to be built from scratch, right? Basically. Everything's laid out from scratch, constructed from scratch. And he just says, these towns are going to be so great that people will just naturally move to them and abandon the old cities. And I just feel like that's A, not very realistic, and B, not very likely. Although I guess it's saying the same thing. I wish he had written a little bit more about how he could see integrating this idea of the Garden City into an existing community. And actually, he would have had to have dealt with that with Letchworth, the city that he and his company First Garden City Limited planned, because Letchworth was an existing community when the land was purchased. So, I mean, that's something to reckon with, right? Like, and I think that's something that city planning even today does, right? Like where uh city planning today deals with how do you implement these principles of land use in a community that already exists, where people already live, and people might be pissed off if you change too much in the wrong way too fast, right? It's a difficult thing. It's a difficult question. But I do, you know, in the case with all utopian type writers, and whether or not Howard is utopian, I think we can debate. But I admire his will to like and the will of his contemporaries to just go for something different, right? Because I think that especially today, you know, we feel like the conditions as like the conditions under which we live are presented in such a way that like we are sort of made or encouraged to assume that they're like almost natural or that they're permanent, right? No. No. Communities are built and they can be designed. Governments can be in that same way designed. The economics that go into all this also like are designed even in a capitalist society. There's a good deal of sort of meddling in the way that everything is shaped. And I think that this is a good reminder of that. He encourages us, he at the very least encourages us to think to believe that we have agency over our communities and that we could have agency over where we live and how we live, which is always something I like to see. Yeah. And I really like his emphasis on, integrating dense urban space and green space and industrial space and connecting it all via rail lines. I mean, in that way, I feel like, I mean, he was prophetic in predicting and influencing the rise of the city suburb country setup in the United States. Whether that is necessarily an ideal realization of the way that he was thinking, I don't think that's the case. But oh yeah, so and I want to get your opinion on this also, Fred. I think one thing that might have spoiled a little bit of how influential Howard could have been was the invention of the automobile. So these communities that he's talking about in this book are designed with streetcars and trains in mind, and obviously a good deal of pedestrian interaction. But obviously he did not accommodate for the automobile. And at the start of the 20th century, cars were very influential in how cities were designed, laid out, and put together. Um, so I don't know, Fred, what do you think? Like, could Howard have been more influential if it wasn't for the existence of the car, or how do you think that shakes out?
No, yeah, I think that's actually a pretty good question. You know, like Howard wrote this text. I don't know much about the history of automobiles. I'm not gonna pretend to really know, but I would probably assume that automobiles, in like 1898, for instance, were still in their infancy. I would assume that at that time most people were still using like horse-drawn carriages or, trains, for instance. So like whether or not Howard at the time of writing this text could like foresee the automobile being as big as it is definitely questionable. But I do think that the automobile probably would have like a net negative impact on sort of like Howard's vision here. You think of urban planners like Robert Moses and the sort of like damage he did to like New York City or even Philadelphia, for instance. Or like you look at pictures of older cities, even out in the American Midwest, like St. Louis, I think is one, where if you look at pictures from it, like from the 1920s versus today, there's a far more density in like a lot of our cities, prior to the automobile and the need to build the infrastructure to accommodate it.
Hmm.
Um, Howard's work definitely places emphasis on walking and sort of having sort of compact, space in some areas, but also spread out space in the form of large gardens and boulevards. Whether or not cars would be compatible with that, you know, it is a pretty interesting question. I do think Howard very much was in the purview of thinking like trains or like trolley cars being the primary mode of transport, whether it's like humans or commodities. I would assume that, on some level, cars may be kind of compatible with his vision, but also not. Um, I really can't say for sure. But I think given how reliant, at least we here in the United States are on automobiles and how sort of like suburbanization post like World War II and everything has sort of, like it could be argued that it has stifled the development of housing or of cities or just the efficiency of like how we structure our living space. um, I don't think it would have had like a positive impact on the vision that he was sort of hashing out here.
Hmm. Um, Now something I was thinking about, what is did he ever talk about in this text? I don't remember him mentioning what the breakdown of like incomes would be. Would there be a great diversity in the level of income that people can have or not? Because he does mention like that there would be this like sort of council of successful people running the city. But it also seems
Yeah,
to me that this is like a fairly egalitarian project that would require, some like sort of leveling in the incomes of the people who ran the city and the people who like ran the various markets and businesses.
I mean, I think it kind of varies because from what I recall, for instance, let's see here. When he kind of goes into the sewage question here at the beginning of the book, um, he basically states that farmers would be willing to pay higher rents for their land because of like the adjacency to the city. Whereas like farmers, I guess like in their pre-Garden City state in Howard's conception live further from the city. They have to pay more for transport of their goods there to those like markets and whatnot. Having them be directly adjacent to the urban core, having the rail lines available for like export to external markets, it would naturally lead to higher income and sort of like lower transportation expenses. Additionally, the municipality in Howard's conception simply owns the land.
Hmm.
The different individuals and the different like factories, the different firms can rent it from the municipality and sort of compete, in that marketplace. So I would assume that, wages kind of follow the sort of like standard pressures of inflation and supply, demand, all of those factors. But the sort of like taxation would be egalitarian.
Hmm. I'm also curious. I have two sort of leading questions here. Now, Howard being a Georgist, and Georgism is actually still a movement that's around today. I don't really know that much about the history of it, but I do know that they emphasize the idea of a land value tax, not only as a means of more justly organizing society, but as a means to more justly organize and plan property use, right? Um, so we know, like with Letchworth, which is like the existing um like Garden City analog that Howard contributed to. Um, like I said before, the municipality owns most of the land, and that they use the rent that they collect to reinvest in the community, right? Almost like a credit union model of like urban use, right? Now, obviously, since the city exists in the nation of the UK, obviously, whatever other taxes that go to the federal or, whatever the parliamentary British government. Um, do you think that a land value tax is necessary to realizing this kind of community? And B, is that a good thing? Right? Like, I could see maybe even getting like libertarians on board with an idea of a city like this if you say, oh, we'll abolish the income tax and instead have a single land value tax. I don't know. What do you think, Fred?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty interesting question. I mean, whether or not land value tax is the only form of taxation like really necessary to build a garden city. Um, I don't know. I think revenue can be raised in other ways. I think like an income tax or sales tax could probably, raise funds to sort of like finance this kind of project. Um, I do think like a much larger question would be, could a project like this sort of exist, you know, in an ideal sense, while withstanding the external pressures of like the society, that contains it. Like the Garden City is not like a self-contained entity, it's connected to like, a wider national economy, a national political system. The land value tax may be the only tax that the Garden City as a municipality sort of inflicts on its citizens. However, the national or even provincial government may sort of incur certain sales tax or property tax, income, state taxes, or inheritance taxes, even. So, I mean, that would be a big question as well, because it's like you not only have the taxes that you're paying to the municipality, but you have the taxes that you're paying to the layers of government above that. And also, too, how the layers of government above the Garden City regulate it.
Hmm.
Municipalities do exist within the context of like larger provincial and sort of like federal or national bodies that may have certain regulations about like how you may build things or how you may structure things. Um, the sort of regulations around certain industry or agriculture. It's like whether or not, a garden city project can be completely autonomous, I think is like a much more pressing question, because clearly if there are certain regulations about how you produce things, when you can produce things, the methods by which you can do it, regulations around like housing or, like various tax structures, it could effectively make this project impossible. The civilization it's in, isn't structured like that. So I think the question of autonomous organization is like a much more interesting question to sort of tackle when thinking about like a project like this.
Yeah, that's probably true. Because, for this to come together, it would require like a great deal of autonomy or agency be afforded to the municipality itself. And in this day and age, I'm not sure how much would be, right? The other, but it is nonetheless cool to think about, like this like plan or proposal by Ebenezer Howard, being part of not only like a land use proposal, but also sort of like like a proposal having to do with the financial structure of a municipality. Um, and how much he gets into that, I think, is very valuable, even if it's not entirely possible. Um, yeah. And the last thing that I wanted to bring up is what do you think? Well, okay, so there's two groups I want to engage in this. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the one group that I'm going to bring up, but if you are, then definitely weigh in on it. What do you think, like people who are into urbanism today and into, for lack of a better term, city planning discourse, um, what can we learn from Howard as we talk about affordable housing today and city planning today and how we should run our cities? Because here in Philadelphia, I don't think that we will be able to fully implement the idea of a garden city, but are there nonetheless ideas in that, in Howard's proposal that we could find useful, right? And second, and again, if you're not familiar, if you aren't, then maybe I'll just speak on this at the end. There is like sort of this like I don't know if you want to call it a subculture or if you want to call it as like sort of an aesthetic group, but there's a group of, we'll call it a literary subgenre or an aesthetic subgenre called solar punk. Are you familiar, Fred?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Solar punk, sort of the direct opposite of cyberpunk,
Yeah, I mean
for
it's
lack of a
more
better way of phrasing
speculative,
it.
more
Yeah.
optimistic, you
More like
know.
environmentalist, more
Yeah,
like pro-human,
yeah,
almost naturalist.
and I really wonder if the solar punk movement could engage with a text like this because they do like a lot of what their aesthetic is about imagining a new way forward for what our communities literally look like, right? And a lot of it is like very fantastical, like airships and solar panels and all that. I'm not sure if you've seen much of it, but to me, like reading Howard, there is a thread that leads from him into like, from him talking about the Garden City leading into solar punk today, which is a group of people who are imagining, our communities, cities in many cases being brighter and cleaner and run with renewable energy and built like with tighter knit communities in mind. I see a through line there. And I really wish I was more familiar with solar punk to speak more intelligently on it, but it's like kind of neat. I feel like I can see connection. But anyway, feel free to speak on either of those topics. I'm just like kind of
No,
thinking out
yeah,
loud.
yeah. Like as far as like urbanists go, I'm not too involved in like urban or city planning discourse.
Oh,
Like
I'm way too into it. I'm like step back for a bit on it even.
like pretty residual, just kind of like, just obviously wanting to see more public transport, denser housing, more housing, at least like where I am, given the supply isn't really there. I guess like one thing Howard sort of like encourages us to do is sort of step out of the paradigms of like what we historically have been dealing with. Like in Howard's time, it was like the country or the city, suburbs really weren't that big of a thing. And I think like in urban planning discourse, we typically think like suburbs versus urban core or like public transport versus car. I guess like challenging us to sort of like maybe recontextualize that narrative and find like a newer approach or one that's like more nuanced or holistic. Like I really can't say for certain what that would look like, but if I just had to give like my impression of it, like I can speak a little bit better on the solar punk aspect of it.
Oh yeah,
sort of like
by all
like
means.
imagining our cities being, or like just our living spaces being more environmentally friendly, encouraging us to sort of incorporate the natural world into our living space a little more proactively. I think people think of cities being this place that's, these places that are devoid of nature, or the suburbs having the facade of it, think like of the grass lawn with no flowers, no natural plants, like no environmental fixtures really. Solar punk really encouraging us to not only incorporate the natural world as like an aesthetic piece, but also understanding our place in it as ourselves being, natural beings, and sort of being stewards of it. So I do think it sort of like recontextualizes the development and sort of design of our cities too. Instead of like glass towers architecture, having sort of I guess like a like lack of a better way of phrasing it, like green towers architecture.
Hmm.
I really don't know, but sort of like challenging us to incorporate more of the natural world into our design of our living space.
Yeah, yeah. And I hope, maybe we two guys on the internet might encourage people to give it a second look. And whether you're an urbanist or whether you're a solar punk or whether you're just interested in these topics, consider giving Ebenezer Howard a look. I think maybe he's a little bit more obscure than he should be because he only ever wrote like one thing, one and a half to two things, depending on how you count his earlier book. Because, well, so I think I did mention that Garden Cities of Tomorrow is like a revised version of his earlier book. So, he like he was very well read and he did try to put his ideas in practice, but he didn't really write that much.
But to be fair, he is quite successful for being kind of like a one-hit wonder obscure writer.
Yeah.
The breadth of influence he had on certain communities was definitely felt. In like many respects, you could say he was more successful than some other prolific writers of his time.
Yeah. Well, because he did have a chance to put his ideas into practice, and other people put them into practice too. So yeah, but nonetheless, little under the radar here. So check him out, y'all. Check him out. Any last thoughts, Fred?
No, I mean, not that I can really think of. One thing I think Howard challenges us to do is to recontextualize the environment that we live in. And if you have a sort of issue facing your community, whether it's certain utilities or whether it's like certain zoning regulations, cost of housing, etc., be a little bit more involved maybe. Visit your local zoning board, your town, hall meeting, or like a focus group. Yeah, I mean, just be like Howard.
Be like Howard. So with that, we're gonna wrap it up. I hope you guys have enjoyed listening to us today talking about Garden Cities of Tomorrow by Ebenezer Howard. For our next episode, which we're going to hope to do in the fall, we will be doing a fiction piece, our first one. So keep an eye out.
Very much
Um,
excited for it.
yeah. This has been Rot Teahouse. Our cover art is by Marta Syrup, and our opening and ending song is by Antonio. Hope you guys have a nice day.